Hello everyone, we're going to start in just about 2 minutes here. While we wait, could someone confirm that you can hear me okay, see my screen? Oh, thank you very much, Michael. Perfect, perfect, thank you all. Give it about 1 more minute here. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Give folks an extra minute here to dial in. Looks like we still have some folks dialing in. This is being recorded, so if you have to step away for a moment or you're joining us late, we'll get this posted up on Vimeo shortly after today's presentation. So hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our asset management webinar series. Today I'm a different voice than the first session. First session was hosted by Mike and Billy. I am Nick Velick, the services manager here at Syrison. So a little on my background. So I've been at Syrison 3.5 or so years now. Came in as a consultant, previously worked at in higher ed, IT as well, and kind of manage the consultants now and do some consulting myself, and asset management consulting being one of the main types of consulting as well. Of course, we do a lot with service management as well and automation and so forth, which we're actually going to touch on some of that during this webinar series anyway. So for those of you who might not have seen the first webinar, we do have it recorded, and in that webinar, Mike and Billy gave a overview of, what's new in Syrison Asset Management, kind of an introduction to asset management overview, all the classes and importing data. So the goal, takeaway, and hopefully where you're at, resulting from that section is you have the first kind of checkpoint done. You've gotten maybe your initial data in the system. You've got it installed at least. You have some data, maybe not all of it, but some data in the system into Service Manager, and you're starting to get maybe a feel for the tools and some data. But that's step one. It's a great part to get to have some data and to start managing your assets initially, anyway. But that's kind of half the battle. As we all know, once you get your assets in there, a minute can go by and now your asset data can potentially be out of date if it's not upkept moving forward. So getting everything into the system is a great first step. Understanding the system, what's there, and getting it configured the way it should be for your organization, super important. But that is only step 1 of 2, and it's truly a halfway point. So every organization is going to have its own processes, and that's really the key to today's webinar, is establishing what those processes are unique to your organization, and they will truly differ from organization to organization. A lot of stuff in common as well, but there will certainly be unique elements to each organization. So what processes do we have to consider? How do we establish those processes, map them, in other words, put them on paper and document them, get it out of our heads and onto a better way to communicate, a more formalized document or some sort of place that someone else could go and get that information. So once those are established, how do we use those effectively? We got them on paper. We know what our processes are, what our expectations are, kind of as an asset manager. Well, there's an important training element that has to go along with that, and then kind of a monitoring of that process, established process to see what we're not going to get everything right on the first try. So what do we get wrong? What can we refine? What's working? What isn't? How can we make this process better? There's this continual process improvement that has to go along with asset management, just like the service manager side of things. And this is all going to be important to keep those assets up to date. Ultimately, the asset manager isn't going to be the person making every little change to the system. You're going to need to rely on your desktop teams, your service desk teams, whoever else might, your procurement teams, whoever might order assets, get them in the system, or just change the state of them, deploy an asset, recover an asset. Chances are you're going to have to depend on a lot of different people to do that, and it's a kind of a two-way street. You have to set those expectations for what you expect as an asset manager to be done, and when that needs to be done. And once that's established, communicate that, train on that, make sure folks are on the same page as far as what they need to do to help you keep the system up to date, and then audit that. Make sure so when you do have cases of failure, the last point here is identifying invalid cases, and what do you do with those invalid cases? Do we brush them off as one-offs? Do we dig in and figure out, was this just a mistake? Do we have a flaw in our process? Do we have a mistake in some automation maybe somewhere? But fixing that, not letting these issues kind of go unnoticed, and it's going to be a constant adjustment and refining of these processes to ultimately the end goal is you've got all your stuff in the system. How do we keep that stuff accurate? How do we keep those hardware assets to be in a dependable format? Because we all know if we have hardware assets in our environment that are clearly wrong, then we lose a lot of credibility in the asset systems, the data that we have, and keeping that credibility is certainly important. You're never going to have a perfect system, but as accurate as it can be is going to go a long way. So that's what we're going to cover during today's session, part 2. To give you an idea of the next session, so after this session, we're going to and I'll be hosting next month's session as well. This will be in September. We've identified maybe some roadblocks, some issues we're having with our processes that we've established in this session, and how do we fix those? Are there ways that we can proactively fix those, prevent those issues from happening? Are there at least ways we can report and figure out why those things are happening, or what issues are happening most often? So kind of prioritizing, figuring out what's going wrong most often that's leading to inaccurate data, and how can we fix that proactively. Kind of more of a proactive focus in this one. So looking at portal customizations that might be able to help with that. And then the last session, which will be a month later, October, is a little bit more of the reactive and the automation side of things. So when something goes wrong, rather than the asset manager at some point finding that issue and trying to correct it, how can we notify either the person who made the mistake or maybe the asset manager in real time, so that those issues are in the moment called out and fixed and addressed, and not kind of piling up as time goes on. Maybe you're only auditing once a month, and if you do that, you potentially have a month's worth of mistakes to fix. It could be the same mistake even. So how can we use automation perhaps to increase the consistency in our data? Perhaps tying into the ITSM side of things. If you maybe tie hardware asset management into a device deployment service request, you might have different steps that could update some of these asset records for you as you go along, and not have to rely on training and your desktop service desk team to set some critical fields. And then kind of where to go from here. So the last, how do we continue to improve? What are some kind of next steps after we've done all of this? And the vacations part there is, of course, once you've done all this, you'll have a much better inventory and can, of course, afford maybe take a vacation or two. So without further ado, let's get into today's topics. So types of processes to consider. So with hardware asset management, we really want to start with the core hardware asset lifecycle. So when we look at kind of what that entails, and ordering hardware is where it starts. So the hardware has to be ordered, and then eventually that hardware comes in, it has to be received. And then at some point, maybe an asset tag is thrown on it, and it's updated in the system, or maybe entered in the system for the first time. Then the devices need to be prepared. Maybe they're prepared, they're imaged, they're sysprepped, and they're ready for stock, and they'll go out eventually when ad hoc as folks request them. Or maybe they're devices that are for a specific purpose, that are to be configured and deployed that moment. Once they come in, as soon as possible, get them set up and deployed. So there's a couple different states that you might need to use to represent that. And then once they're out in the environment, they're deployed, and at some point down the line, they'll come back, and they might be retired, they might go back to stock. At some point though, those devices are going to get disposed. So when they're outside of IT's control, and they're maybe donated or they're e-wasted, those would be officially disposed devices that you don't have any sort of liability for or need to track at that point. So these life cycles conveniently kind of match up with the hardware asset status list in Service Manager. So for those of you that have installed Cyrus and Asset Management, you'll have seen this list before. And of course, it kind of lines up right. The out-of-box list lines up pretty much right with what I have on the left there. So ordered, received, in stock, deployed, and then of course loaned, which is not there. So there are a few other oddball statuses. So these are kind of outside of the core primary life cycle of a device, but they'll happen in just about every environment. So hardware, you might have a loaner pool, or devices loaned out on a kind of a temporary basis. You might have a need to reclaim loaners that are out that haven't been returned yet, that should have been returned. You might need to figure out what is our process for when a device is stolen or goes missing. Are they the same process? Are they different? Maybe a police report involved in one and not the other. Are there any cases where devices are reclaimed from being deployed and they shouldn't be wiped and back to the stock pool or retired? Maybe they need to be held with data on them for a certain amount of time before that can happen. So there might be some other kind of temporary or kind of oddball hardware asset lifecycle cases, but you're likely to have some combination of all this stuff. So how do we figure out, for your organization, what should this look like? What different statuses can we, are valid in our environment, and kind of what can go from one status to another? So I like to kind of go through this first by kind of mapping these different statuses out, because ultimately every single status change, when something goes from the stockroom out to deployed, you have a set of items that you need to have happen as the asset manager. You need to make sure that your desktop team, your service desk team, or whoever's deploying that asset, you need to make sure they're clear on what you expect from them, what you need them to follow when that happens. Otherwise, your inventory won't be kept up to date if you aren't setting those expectations. So first we have to figure out what can change. And we're of course going to start over all the way on the left with the ordered status. So that's the earliest a device will be in our environment, kind of in any form. Of course, if the device isn't ordered, there's not going to be a record of it. But the second that you click order on that, on whatever site or whatever you're ordering from, you're now financially on the hook to some extent. So devices really should be captured and in the system in that ordered status kind of at that point. That's the first reasonable place we might need to start tracking. So once it's in an ordered status, you don't have all the information quite yet. You likely don't have serial number. You likely don't, maybe you don't know who it's going to. Maybe it's just a stock machine. You're not going to have a location. You're not going to have all sorts of other information. You won't have an asset tag, because you kind of need the device to be physically present to put that on there and to capture it. So you'll have kind of a shell of an asset in the ordered status. Now, once that device is shipped and you unbox it, the only place that ordered can really go is to the received status. At that point, your asset management, your procurement team, whoever it might be, is going to be changing the status of those assets from ordered to received, and they're going to be adding a few key bits of information. So at this point, we have the serial numbers. We can assign a serial number to each of those devices that are in our system. We can put an asset tag on now, and we can start to track uniqueness in a couple different ways, asset tag and serial. It might be going to a certain stock room or to a certain person at that point. So there's, there might be a received date field you need to set. That might be a key field because it ties into the warranty potentially. That warranty might start counting down from the day it's received. So plenty of extra fields to set when an item is received. And now once an item is received, there's really two things that can happen. So it can go directly to stock, be set up, image sysprepped, and put into a stock room ready to go when it's next requested. Or of course, it could be ordered for a specific purpose and go right to the person who it's intended for. It might skip that whole stock process. Now, of course, when that happens, fields need to change, and that's actually going to be what we're going to get to next. So once a machine is in stock, it can essentially be deployed at that point, or way down the line, it can be retired. Of course, you're not going to go right to that for a new device, but machines will eventually come back to stock, and at some point they'll need to move that retired status. So on that note, they can go from deployed back to in stock. Now, it might not be that simple, and this is the first kind of potential area where you might need to add a custom status. So what we have here is, seen some organizations add kind of custom statuses to represent devices that have come back that have data on them that need to be held for a certain period of time. Maybe it's for legal reasons. Maybe it's you have a policy that you maybe give the users a couple weeks to let you know if they forgot to back anything up on their computer. So it might not go from deployed to in stock. It might go from deployed to a data hold status. You might have a kind of queue of machines that are lined up for the desktop team to go through and wipe. They're ready to be wiped. They just haven't been wiped yet. And then of course, once they have been wiped, maybe they go back in stock and they're ready. Their image sysprepped and ready to go again when they're next called upon, and then retired. Of course, maybe a machine, you reclaim that machine for whatever reason. Maybe it's an off-boarded employee, or maybe it's an old machine. And you might evaluate at that point and say it's too old for stock. It's not a machine we want to deploy again, so we move it to that retired pile. The assumption being data's been removed from it, and it's still under your control, sitting in a physical room somewhere in your organization, but hasn't yet been e-wasted or donated or whatever needs to happen next. Okay, so that's kind of the core, and then there's of course some one-offs we mentioned. Once it's retired, it can go to disposed, but not really backwards in any case. You can have something go from disposed back to any of these statuses, and generally speaking, this is pretty much the flow that the core flow that most of the hardware assets will go through as they're in your environment. You might have some one-off changes and some edge cases here that you need to accommodate. But some clear cases. You're not going to have a device go from deployed to ordered, for example. That's kind of a strange one. So you do have your loaners as well. So you have these kind of in stock deployed corresponding statuses for loaners. Out of box, it's called loaned, and then you often see folks add in a status to represent a loaner that's in stock versus a loaner that's deployed. You might want to differentiate your stock for new machines compared to your stock for loaning. And so how can a device get to the loaner in stock status? And that could, you could have a machine maybe ordered and then received specifically for stock, but more often than not, folks tend to take their stock machines and put them into a loaner pool. So maybe this machine isn't good enough to go out and be someone's core machine, but if they need to borrow it for some reason, we can still get a couple good years out of it before it needs to be retired. So you might have some machines that are in your loaner stock. Then of course, when they're in the loaner stock, they go out, be deployed, then come back, back and forth as often as need be. Then eventually your stock loaners are going to go to retired all the same. So the last but not least little item we have here might be dealing with stolen and missing devices. And I'm not going to draw arrows for this one because we'd have a lot of arrows, but essentially everything in that box could technically be stolen or technically go missing. If a device is disposed, you don't care about it anymore. You don't have any sort of visibility into it, so that wouldn't make really any sense. And then ordered, you could make an argument that there's missing stuff that's been ordered and never was received, could potentially make that a different status, or potentially deal with that. Maybe see some folks break up stolen into one category, missing into another. So you really got to just look at what do you need to track from like an audit standpoint, and do you need to break that up? And ultimately, with all of these, we have a lot of boxes that represent a lot of different hardware asset statuses and a lot of arrows. And then whenever you have an arrow going from one box to another, we need to establish a process so what data has to change when a device goes from received to in stock? What data needs to change when it goes from retired to disposed? And if you just kind of give this system to your analysts without identifying any of that, they're not going to know what to set. There's a lot of fields. Cyrus Asset Management Solution has a lot of different properties for every single hardware asset out there, as well as every other class that comes with the solution. And you're not going to need every single field. Everyone's needs are different, and if there's a field in there, someone at some point had a need for that, but that doesn't mean that that's the norm. It doesn't mean that every single field, you don't necessarily get maximum value by filling out every field possible. Where you get kind of the most value out of the product is identifying which fields you truly need to know, you truly care about, and making sure that those are captured 100% of the time. And these other kind of nice to have fields, they can kind of muddy the waters a bit. If for example, if you have maybe 20 different fields that could be set when a device is deployed, if only 4 of them or 5 of them are really important to you as far as your device replacement policy or maybe your loaner retrieval policy or whatever that might be, if you're having folks focus on fields that aren't as important, you're going to miss the ones that are. So you want to really kind of establish what needs to change now to get from one status to another. And we have a question or a comment. So we customize the portal to show only fields we use, including some custom fields. And that's a great suggestion, Brian. And it's definitely one I would recommend. And we'll touch on that briefly in the third webinar in the series. Is once we've figured out what we need and what we don't need, we might have a bunch of fields that we determine we don't need showing up on the form. And if we can hide those and make it an easier kind of puzzle to solve for our analysts when they're deploying assets or retrieving assets to stock, then we make it a lot less complex and easy to follow for them. We know that the fields that are on the form are the fields we care about. Maybe we even make them required so that they're not missed. And that way we kind of ensure that the right data, the data we really, really need to be updated is updated, and that less important stuff we maybe don't care about so much. And by the way, if anyone has questions or comments or anything along the way, feel free to throw them in the questions chat. We do have time in this webinar for plenty of questions. Okay, so what I'm going to start with, I have it kind of highlighted here in green. We're going to start by looking at the deployment process. So we've established from our process mapping here, our status mapping, that devices can go either from received to deployed or in stock to deployed. But there's not really another way they can get deployed. They wouldn't be retired to deployed. They wouldn't be needs wiped to deployed. They wouldn't be loaner to deployed. It's going to come from one of those two places. So when a hardware asset is deployed, what do we need to capture? And how I like to approach this is look at that hardware asset form and determine what fields need to be set. So we're actually going to take a quick look at that. So over to my lab environment. Okay, so here I have just a plain old hardware asset, and we look at some of the fields that are here. And so this is the default form. And as I mentioned, we'll get into how to customize this, maybe make it a bit more sensible for your environment in the next webinar. But right off the bat, we see asset name, we see hardware asset ID. Asset name might be the first field to consider. When you deploy an asset, you might have renamed that computer. It might be stock machine 001 when it's in the stock room, and then when it's deployed, it might, you'll have some sort of naming convention for your machines, and that's going to get set. So do you want to set this when it gets deployed? And some do, some don't. You don't need to, because this machine in all likelihood is going to be enrolled in Configuration Manager, and that'll get updated. Assuming there's actually an option in asset management if you want to update this asset name field with the most up-to-date name on the network. So if you have that box ticked, then this will go out for a day or so as stock 001, stock machine 001, but then ultimately when configman picks it up, it'll rename it and it'll be updated here. So that's a questionable one. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Depends on how acceptable is it. Is a day's worth of outdated information for asset name okay? And is that worth having your analysts fill that out? Primary user is another one that's in kind of that same bucket. Primary user is going to be set by the device affinity data in Configuration Manager. And that's a scary way to say who uses this device most often. So based on the rules you set up in Configuration Manager, based on login attempts or amount of time logged in, so forth, you can kind of determine, maybe this machine was issued to one person, but it's used by another. So primary user, you rarely are going to be setting that manually. It's more of an operational field. It's not, the person who's using the machine isn't going to necessarily tell you whose machine it is. A great example being if this was maybe a public space machine at a university, you might have a student using this all the time, and it's in maybe a public lab. Well, the primary user is helpful to know who's using that. Maybe there's a virus on the machine, you have to contact that person. But if the machine goes missing, that person isn't going to help you out, really. They just use it. They're going to be just as confused as you, probably. So probably not a field you have to set, although you could, depending on what fields you determine are important here. Catalog item, not relevant here. That could be set for you kind of automatically through the workflows in asset management, or it could be something that was manually set at an earlier stage in the life cycle. Most likely during the ordering stage, you would know the catalog item already in all likelihood. So manufacturer model, you'd probably have set already. Same with serial, same with asset tag. That would all get set either during ordered or received or both, depending on which one it is, what fields we're talking about. But the hardware asset status, that's one for sure we're going to need to change. If this machine is going from stock to deployed, we're going to need to change that to deployed. 10 times out of 10, that's going to have to happen. Hardware asset type, again, not something we're going to really change. That's probably already set for us. But location, that's the next one, and maybe we have a need to set the location. This is going to maybe this particular location, so let's link it up and now have a record that's where it's going. But again, maybe that's not necessary for your organization. For example, maybe your naming convention alone tells you the location and you're not even using location. Or maybe you're using the subnet to location matching feature in Cyerson Asset Management. So maybe that's automatically set for you. So don't bother your analysts with it because it'll get set. You don't have to worry about, take those manual steps out of it and don't worry about all these manual changes. Organization could be another one. Maybe when it's in stock, you don't know what, is going to be an IT machine, an HR machine, or so forth. Maybe you only know that once it's deployed. Maybe you're not even using organization. Some folks do, some folks don't. Or maybe you could have that set kind of ahead of time. So not something you're likely going to need to set there. And as well as associated configuration item. When the machine is joins AD, is enrolled in configman, you'll have this record once your connectors run and update this device. But that's something it'll do that matching based on the serial number, so you don't have to set that manually. It'll auto associate down the line, so don't bother your analysts with updating that. So we have a question from Nathir. Location is like a list, or can we get that from AD? So location is another object entirely in Cyerson Asset Management. It's a whole nother module. So just like a hardware asset, a software asset, a vendor, a contract, location is just another type of item. And the location, it's more than just the name of it directly. Not much filled out with this particular location, but a location can have an address, city, state, so forth, all that. Could maybe have a different tax rate, could maybe have a contact, a particular contact for that location, or so forth. So there's lots of other data. So it's not as simple as just a list value, because there's other important information potentially associated with that contract. Okay, so manual inventory date's the next field here. Maybe that is something you set. Technically, the day that you deploy this, you've manually inventory. You had a manual inventory date really is representing of when was there a last pair of human eyes on this saying this is where we think it is, and the day it's deployed, that's true. That's a true case. You've looked at that device, you've put it in a cube, and it's the last time it's been manually inventoried. And so maybe you have a process that you want to make sure that devices are manually inventoried every quarter, every 6 months, every year. And so maybe down the line, and we'll hopefully get to this later today, maybe you make a view of devices that haven't been inventoried manually for a certain amount of time. So if you have a need to set that field, then make sure you identify it as a field that you need to have set when a device is deployed, and make sure your analysts are aware to do that, because that's one that they might just not think to set. So warranty contract, that's likely to have been set when it was received, and same with the support contract. So now into the next tab, the finance tab, there's another pretty important piece of information in here. So cost center, you're not going to worry about here. That would have been handled through the ordering receive state, more likely. Ordering state, most likely. Custodian, though, is going to be a field that typically will need to be set when a hardware asset is deployed. So you have two kind of user relationships in here. You have primary user, which we looked at first on that general tab, and you have custodian. So the primary user told us, based on that automatic info from config-man, who's using it. Custodian is typically used to be a manual field that says who is responsible for this. So kind of like the RACI matrix kind of element, you have responsible and accountable. This is the person that's accountable when a machine goes missing. This device was issued to this person, and it is in their custody now. They have to return it to us when they leave, or they're responsible if it goes missing. They are the point of contact for that machine. So it's something you're going to want to set. And a lot of the time, your custodian primary user will probably be the same person, but in the cases of shared machines, it definitely won't be. And you might even have cases where maybe the manager is the custodian and the employee is not. You might have a manager that oversees the fleet of equipment. So a few other items. So purchase order invoice probably won't get set. Expected date, receive date, of course, those would already be set. Currency, cost, master lease warranty starts, those are all set. Loan return date, loan return date would certainly be something you want to have set during the loaner process, but we're talking through just a typical deployment here. Disposal date reference, that's actually kind of silly to have filled out here. Those you wouldn't fill out here, but you might fill out the assign date. So the assign date, maybe you want to set that the day it goes out, but we're seeing a little bit of redundancy here potentially. We already have the manual inventory date. We have now the assign date that might say the date that this actually went out. But keep in mind that there's other ways to find that information. So even just saving this form here, so we've updated some information. The machine's been deployed, and we have our assign date. But let's say I didn't set my assign date, and let's say that maybe you need that assign date because you always replace equipment 3 years after it's been deployed. And so maybe that assign date field is critical, and you want to be able to quickly query all devices that are 3 years old or more so that you can focus on those during like a hardware refresh. But maybe you don't do it based on date. Maybe you just say, hey, this is the year that we're replacing all machines, all Lenovo W541s are getting replaced this year. And doesn't really matter when it was deployed. You might have that as your kind of primary device for 6 months to a year. And so you'll have a little bit of a range there as far as how long they've actually been deployed, but maybe that's the model you're targeting this year for replacement. So then a date field wouldn't really be necessary. So if you needed to maybe for some one-off oddball case determine when a machine was deployed, remember you have a history tab, and I can see every single change that's been made to this device. So we can see that the change I just made here, I changed the hardware asset status from in stock to deployed on this date right here, and this is the person who did it. So you can figure out when a device is deployed based on the history alone if it's kind of a one-off case. And typically the answer is, yeah, we want to have every piece of information. That's important to us. But make sure that it truly is the most important. It is an important field for you. While it's nice to have more and more information, have this form be as complete as possible, you got to remember that it's typically not going to be your asset admin making these changes. And I have seen organizations where everything does flow through that asset manager. The desktop team, if they deploy a machine, they send an email to the asset manager and they update the device. But this is a task that can be outsourced depending on the organization to the desktop team, to the service desk team as they're deploying, retrieving hardware assets. And you have to make sure that as that's happening, they know what fields are most important. And we can clean this up, and we'll take a look at it in the next webinar as well, to maybe, if there's fields we're not using, make sure that they're maybe hidden, or maybe simply things like moving the custodian to a different location might be something that helps folks understand the system a bit more. So we want to kind of sort through this and figure out sorry, there we go. So what fields do we need to change when a device is deployed? And based on this, just as an example, maybe we want to set status, location, custodian, assign date. Maybe that's what we've determined we need, fulfills all of our requirements for hardware refresh and all of our audit purpose, everything we need for audit reasons. These are the fields we need, and only these fields are the fields we need. So, if you say go fill out these 20 fields when you deploy an asset, there's a large likelihood that a couple of those are missed. And that's, it's human nature. The more that has to be remembered and carried out, the more likely there are to be mistakes. So we'll also look in the next section, the next webinar, how we could make this a little bit more of a, how we could make this more of a mistake-proof process. So rather than say, hey, analysts, remember these are the 4 fields we need, how could we maybe prompt them for those 4 fields and say, just set these, hit OK, you're done. So we'll look at that in the next webinar. So in this case, we set these fields, deployments happen, these are the fields we need, and we've kind of put that on paper, and our deployment process is essentially now been recorded. So we need to look at pretty much every single one of these items and make sure that we identify the fields that we need when items go into that state. And also the other point I have on here is, are there any differences when a machine goes from stock to deployed versus from received to deployed? For example, you might have a process established to say when a device goes from received to in stock that maybe 2 other fields are set. And if a machine were to go right from received to deployed and skip that in stock step, then you need to make sure that those extra 2 fields are captured. That might differ slightly because it's maybe skipped. It's technically the in stock step and then the deployed step. But that can be tedious for our analysts to kind of hop through each of those life cycles when you go a bit more direct. So you want to make sure that you identify the different fields that are important from one state to another. Now, one other thing I didn't touch on there is the tie-in to service management. And you're gonna have some processes that are driven primarily by your asset manager, refresh and audit and inventory, all sorts of things like that are going to be kind of driven by the asset manager. But a lot of these one-off individual changes are going to be driven by service management, conveniently in Service Manager, where you have things like incidents, service requests, change requests, all these different work items. So if I were to say, you know, my computer is having an issue, let's hop back over to our lab. So here's my incident. Do a quick refresh. Okay, so if I were to say, hey, I have an incident, computer's broken. If you wanted to have a kind of relationship between this incident and the hardware asset for which it applies, you would need to make sure your analysts know to come into here, find the hardware asset, I guess it's called client in this case, and link it up. So they would need to know to come in here and link the hardware asset, or maybe to come in the hardware asset and link the work item, so that you do maintain that relationship between your ITSM, your service management changes and how they affect your hardware inventory fleet. Because most of this here should be driven by ITSM. You have a request to order some devices for some purpose. You have a request for a new device, maybe comes from stock. You have a request to borrow a loaner. Maybe you have an incident on a machine that's been deployed. And so most of the changes here should be driven by ITSM, but of course you'll have these like annual refreshes that might be driven from more of an asset management point of view rather than ITSM. But for each of those service management driven changes, it's helpful to have that record, that association between work item and the hardware asset, the configuration item. The goal being, if you follow this and link those ITSM items all the way through, you could really see the history, when this device was ordered, when it was deployed, when it had a bunch of issues with its RAM, when its RAM was upgraded, when it was ultimately retired, and when it was disposed. You could kind of see all these different changes to that these requests that drove a change in state. And those changes are going to be done by not your asset manager in most cases. You're going to have to rely on these other groups to make these changes as they come in. So you definitely want to put on paper what you need to change. So you might have to work in and say it's not just these fields, but it's also the relationship here that might come from the work item form rather than the hardware asset form. But it can go from either way. So next, where should this be documented? So let's say at this point, you've got all your assets in your system, you have everything configured, you've looked at all your different statuses, maybe you've made some custom statuses, and you've kind of mapped it all out, what needs to change and when. So where does this need to be documented? And one nice place you could put right in the product itself is in a knowledge article. You can have analyst-facing articles, analyst-only facing articles if you wish. You can have end-user-facing articles, and you can have kind of hybrids that show both. So if you wanted to have kind of this internal set of articles for your analysts, so that, hey, I'm new and I need to go look at our document that says what I need to change, maybe how I change it when I'm deploying a hardware asset, that info needs to be somewhere. We don't want this to be a guessing game. Yes, sometimes we can make that easier through the tool, which we'll get into the next section, the next webinar. But there might be stuff, these oddball cases that need different fields set, and so you want to make sure that info is somewhere retrievable, and that the folks that need that info, maybe your desktop team, your service desk team, your procurement team, they need to know where to find it, and that they're initially trained on it. And you could use something like SharePoint too, if you like. Plenty of other wiki tools out there as well, if you wanted to use something else. But you do have an option right in the product where you could put some of these articles, maybe just one all-encompassing article about hardware asset changes. So make sure that this is documented somewhere. Folks that need to know how to do this know where that info is and are trained on that info. So get into a little bit of other processes to consider here. So one kind of oddball case, I just kind of want to bring this one out, single it out, because it comes up sometimes, and it's one we haven't touched on. maybe you have a need to send a hardware out for repair. Maybe you get a dead on arrival machine and you have to return to the manufacturer. That's an oddball case. It's not going to happen in most cases, but it will happen. And so maybe that's just another square you throw up on your hardware asset status mapping sheet and figure out what status is it. This could go to this and where this could go as a result. Maybe for a machine that does need to be sent out to repair, maybe you replace that machine with a new one, and then when that machine is ultimately repaired, it goes back to stock. Or maybe you truly take that machine from your user, send it out for repair, and give them back their same machine when it's done. Probably not, because there could be a wait period there, but maybe. So you'll have your own kind of procedures for this type of process. It's more of a one-off, but these are the things that tend to get forgotten about. But you don't want to focus on them initially. You don't want to lose focus and cater your processes around these one-offs too much. You want to definitely get your core kind of life cycle flow figured out first, and then think through all these other one-offs, stolen, missing being another one, and figure out what else your organization has a need to track. So manual inventory walkthrough is another process. I've alluded to it a few times, but we haven't really talked about it. So some inventory is not online. You don't have, in all likelihood, monitors reporting back to configuration manager or mice, or I in a former life dealt with point of sale machines and registers, and these little IBM registers had these plastic pieces on them that were like $500 a piece. It was nuts. That's not going to plug into the network and report back, and that could go missing. That could go, through any of the different life cycle phases. If it's something you need to track, you're not going to have it online. So there needs to be manual walkthroughs done for some of those offline assets, and even just a sanity check sometimes. Are we following our processes? Is the equipment that I can physically see in this room, is that reflected properly in the system? And if not, why? We need to kind of look at that and look at those assets and see maybe when they were deployed by who, and maybe what went wrong. Where did we fail to update the system? Who updated this and forgot some certain information, and so forth. And you'll find mistakes through your manual inventories, and we definitely want to make sure that maybe we need a training on the team that did that bulk replacement to make sure that they're tracking the right fields and they know when to update what fields. And a similar idea for hardware refresh cycle. Maybe you're looking at a whole department's machines or a whole set type of model machine and walking through that. So what does that process look like? What do we need to set? And in all likelihood, it's going to be the same fields as here, in all likelihood, for something like a refresh cycle, but it's going to be in bulk, and that's one key difference. Is it's probably not going to be driven by a service request. It's going to be more driven from the asset management side of things. But those machines need to be ordered. They're just going to be ordered in a set of 50 instead of one. They need to be received still. They need to be prepped. They need to be deployed. So in all likelihood, you're still going to follow this, but maybe just in bulk. And for those bulk tasks, we have a nice tool called Asset Excel that you can use. I'm just going to quickly bring this up if you're unfamiliar. So Asset Excel is a nice little tool where you could say, what, we ordered 10 new laptops. So I'm going to open up a new import sheet for these laptops, and maybe I'm going to name these laptops something temporary. So maybe it's stock laptop 81418 number 1, and then maybe I'll import 5 of those. And as I drag those down, it generates a new GUID for it. I could probably set the model for these at the same time. And then beware of Excel doing things like this, where we wouldn't want them to. It is still just Excel. So we could set the status. Maybe these are machines that are ordered and they don't have a serial number yet. They don't have an asset tag yet. But maybe I just want to import. I have this set up to require the serial number. That's just an option in your in your hardware asset settings that you need to have either a serial number or an asset tag. It's going to prevent me in this case until I fill that out. But just like that, I've created 5 new kind of shell of these records as in the system as items, as hardware assets that are in the ordered status. So if I were to refresh this, I could actually see there they are. There are my stock laptops from today. So later on, when these need to be received, someone might come in here, and let's actually close the sheet. Someone might come in here and hit search and show me all items that are in the ordered status. And there they are. And maybe I want to change those to received. I'm looking up on my document that says what fields I need to set, making sure all those fields are set, and I'm updating them when I'm done, when my step's done. So it's the same kind of process. Instead of maybe looking at a specific form and changing one item, you're still doing the same thing, just in bulk, and just make sure you're using a tool that makes sense for that. You wouldn't want to go in here and make 5 records manually or update 5 records manually when you have ways to do that a bit easier. The other thing, so you have automatic creation and updating through the connectors. So a lot of your inventory will come from Configuration Manager or Asset Import. And it has the option, focusing on Configuration Manager and the hardware asset creation workflow that's configured through the settings in hardware and Cyrus and asset management. You have the option to automatically create hardware assets when they're detected on the network, and or automatically update assets when they're detected on the network. And so in theory, you have and this, we live in the real world, so take this with a grain of salt, but when machines are, if every single time a machine was ordered and coming into our environment, assuming we have centralized purchasing and one centralized receiving desk that is entering that hardware, in theory, assets should never just pop up on your network as a new item detected in ConfigMan. If we say they need to be recorded when they're ordered and then updated when they're received, then by the time they're actually deployed and on the network, you're looking at a simple update to the item rather than creation of a new item. And I realize, and coming from higher ed as well, when every department had their own P card and they would order whatever they want, that might not be a good assumption for your organization. So it is going to vary. Maybe you don't have centralized ordering and purchasing, receiving. And so maybe you're going to start at the in-stock or deployed step for some items. When you find an item that's popped up in the network, maybe that's going to trigger you needing to track down what that is and why didn't they FYI IT when they send IT an update when they order that device like they should have. Maybe that's part of your process if you don't have centralized receiving. So you can identify that kind of in bulk through a tool like SCSM View Builder, and just showing that real quick. So I'm going to show this in the console, and then it can be promoted to the portal. But just recognizing that, well, I don't actually think we have a ton of time to show this, but you can show you can create a view, and you can give that view a criteria. So when devices show up in your environment, taking a look at what's in here, devices that are auto-created from Configuration Manager are going to look like the ones I have highlighted on my screen here. They're going to have a hardware asset type of computer, and their hardware asset status is going to be blank. Now, the hardware asset type could eventually change if you have some of the other asset management workflows running to update the type based on maybe a catalog item. But your status will never get set by anything automatic. So if you have an empty status for a hardware asset, that should be kind of a key sign that this asset was not created manually by a person. It was detected on the network, and it's clearly missing some information. I know we have some information in here. Of course, we have probably the model, the manufacturer, the serial number, so forth. But you're going to need to update things like the custodian that are never going to be updated automatically for you. You might need to set the organization, maybe the location, like all these different fields that need to be set. you might have to kind of work backwards and say, why did we miss this device? Why did this just show up if it was supposed to go through that ordering process? This can be classified as a mistake. Maybe this is a device that missed being logged when it was procured, and that's something that can be correctable. Track down, where did this device come from? Who ordered it? Who was supposed to enter it in the system? And point them to the documentation that indicates what they should have said, and have that dialogue with those individuals saying, was this a mistake, or did you not follow parts of our process because the process doesn't make sense? And it is a two-way street. They're going to have to, if you as an asset manager say, I want these 20 fields set, and desktop team says, heck with that, I'm going to fill out these 3. I have too much stuff to do. I'm not going to worry about it. You're going to have a kind of a bit of a collaboration with those folks. Maybe figure out, maybe we don't need to track certain fields, or certain things don't make sense why we're doing them that way. So correct your process rather and train on that, agree to that process, as you're ultimately going to need to collaborate, and it's not going to be a one-person show for managing of inventory. So it's important to always go back and train on that, and identify valid cases like this. So this is a case that we might want to follow up on. Some other cases you might want to follow up on are, maybe you have a device that's been loaned but doesn't have a custodian, or a device that's been loaned and doesn't have a device, a loan return date set. So there are cases like that a process we can clearly say something has been missed, because the current state of the different fields on this asset are invalid. So dig into why that happened, correct the process if need be, train if need be, and maybe get into customization automation, as these next 2 sessions will cover, if it's something that we can maybe proactively kind of prevent, or maybe notify on, so forth. A couple other oddball examples I've seen, which I always find fun. Maybe a hardware asset that has a receive date in the future, or maybe I saw an environment that had iPads that had a purchase date in 2006, which was before Steve Jobs himself had one. So, I mean, you can identify those oddball bits of information, and you need to definitely keep on your radar that you need to track those down and correct those where possible. So we do have a couple minutes here left for questions, and I'm a little bit of a backlog here. So let me kind of work up. So you're having an issue, Brian's having an issue with serial number hardware asset ID, does not appear in config man, serial number is not set, not sure where the settings to use for the hardware asset sync and the asset sync workflow. So the serial number will come over from Configuration Manager, but not Active Directory. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Generally recommend to not bring in machines from Active Directory unless there are machines in Active Directory that are not in Configuration Manager, such as Macs, for example, or mobile devices. They might be in AD, but not config man. Active Directory does not have record of the serial number. So bringing over those machines might cause more problems, because the updating, the matching to see if the device is updated is done on the serial number, regardless what you have set for your hardware asset ID. And I do recommend GUID as your hardware asset ID as well, where possible. One such reason, and given the examples we've been working through here, if you want to get assets in your system when they're ordered, you don't have a serial number yet, and if serial number is a required field, then you couldn't get the devices in your system until they're received. So that kind of restricts your process a bit by having the serial number be the asset ID. Okay, one there from Jason that we answered. Another one, Jason, when entering data to Asset Excel, and you enter a model before entered, how does it get added? I believe this is concerned because model is drop-down menu. So for manufacturer and model, you can have them as list values, and you can have them as string values. And so behind the scenes, there are 2 fields. It's a string, model enum, and model string, I guess, if you want to call it that. And the settings in hardware and Cyerson Asset Management will flip-flop what item shows up on the console or portal form. So if you either use the list or the string. And then as far as how to get those on the asset Excel, there should be a model enum as well as a manufacturer enum. So there should be 2 columns in here. Here's model and then model enum, where it will pull the appropriate one. So it should, so in this case, I have model as, I'm using a string for model, so it's not a list. But if you were using this as an enum, it would show up the little drop down. I think in older versions, it had both columns. So I think the newer versions, it does that dynamically, but I might be incorrect on that. But that's how mine's working, newest one. All right, and then they do share with the catalog item models. It's the same list. Can you show the last slide again? This one here, Navjeet, is that the one you're asking for? And Jason has a question, how is bulk done again? I missed how you got there. So that's through our Asset Excel plugin. So it's just a little MSI file. You can download it. It's part of the asset management solution, softwaredownloads.cyrusson.com. And you download that, it's a little MSI file you run that plugs into Excel. Okay, and can we make any view in the portal but not SCSM? So you can make a view in the console and then you can promote it and show it in the portal. If you're using the view builder tool, you make them in the console, promote them to the portal, but any view you make in the console you can show in the portal. You would do that by just right-clicking it and you hit promote view, and then it'll ask you where you want to promote the view to, and it'll put that view, corresponding view in the portal. There are other ways to make views. You could make different dashboards as well with different searches to show other subsets as well. So there's a few different ways to show these, but we don't have time to get into that. Unfortunately, we are right up against the top of the hour. So I get one more question here. Some vendors provide advanced shipping notice to bulk shipments, so you can have the serial numbers prior to systems arriving in your dock to start the process. More of a comment. Yeah, I mean, if your vendors do that, then that does bypass the restriction, of course, to have them in the system. You can get them in the system when ordered. Some vendors might, some vendors might not. Does the asset history show when an asset is discovered? Yes, it does. It'll show it as created. So looking at one that was created here, this is the console, but it's the same in the portal. If you look at the history tab, the very first entry is at the top, and this is when it was created. So it's going to look like that. Gives it an ID, type, display name, asset name. Okay, and then last question I think I missed is, this is, you asked about hardware asset today. So the focus of this webinar series is on hardware. I don't have a software one on the radar, but not out of the question. We have one of those in the upcoming months. If there's a demand for that, just let us know and we'll maybe get something in the works. Okay, well, everyone, that is we're a minute past here and just about out of time. So thank you all for joining today. As I said, if you joined us late, the recording will be posted up on Vimeo here shortly after we end. And if you missed a part or joined us late, you can pull that down and watch whatever you missed. But thank you all for joining, and have a good day. Talk to you all later.